talk a line in the sand, and it's kind of, it's meant to be ironic because there is no clear line between the two. So just to give you a little roadmap of what I'm going to be talking about in the next 30 minutes, I'm going to talk about, start out with talking a little bit about what I do in my day-to-day job, so you know what kind of lens I'm looking at this issue through. I'm going to touch on ACEs, toxic stress, and how they're related to corporal punishment. I'm going to frame corporal punishment as a public health issue because I would put it right up there with my other two passionate issues of gun violence and obesity. And I'm going to end with two very practical solutions that I would propose we incorporate and promote in our communities to address corporal punishment. So, for the past 13 years, I've been at Stroger. I've had the distinct honor of being on the Child Protective Services team. We evaluate every child that comes through the trauma unit to see if there's any abuse or neglect issues. The other half of my clinical time is spent evaluating children for sexual abuse at the Chicago Children's Advocacy Center. I'm also honored to serve on a multidisciplinary team where we look at the process that we're going through, what we do well, what we don't do well, and how we can improve. And I also have the unique distinction of being on the Cook County Child Death Review team, which is hard to put into words, but it's really a place where, again, we get together across the disciplines to try to improve things to prevent needless deaths of children. So some important numbers, just to give you a little idea of what's been happening in Illinois. The most recent numbers from DCFS for 2011 list about 250,000 calls being made to the hotline. A little less than half of those are taken as reports, and about a quarter of those are indicated. And a smaller number of children, about 4% of the indicated of the reports taken are taken into custody or temporary foster care. So, with regard to corporal punishment, if there is an indication by DCFS of physical abuse made, then they would fall into this green part of the pie chart. So it represents about 8% of all indicated reports of child abuse and neglect. Neglect by far predominates, so about 75% to 80% of all indicated reports are for child neglect. ACEs. How many people have heard of that Adverse Childhood Experiences Study? It's great. It is my personal goal, and one of my residents and students are here today, and my goal is to make sure every student and resident who rotates with our division in Child Protective Services knows about ACEs before they finish the month. And if they don't, then I failed. Because this is, I think, the single most important study published in the medical literature in my lifetime. Okay? So what is an ACE score? It's calculated by adding up the affirmative responses to questions about childhood history, physical, sexual, emotional abuse, neglect, divorce, domestic violence exposure, substance abuse, mental illness, and having an incarcerated family member. If you Google ACEs questionnaire, you can pull up the actual questionnaire. It's beautifully simple. It's 10 questions, and with each affirmative answer, a person gets a point. And what the study showed in the huge number of patients they studied was that there was a very powerful dose-response relationship between the ACE score and the health problems and poor quality of life. So the higher your ACE score, the higher your risk was of developing any of these medical conditions or being involved in a relationship that involved interpersonal violence. And there's another term that I think you're going to be hearing a lot of because the American Academy of Pediatrics has adopted the term toxic stress, which I see as interchangeable with ACEs. And I love this definition. I came across this, and I think it puts it so well. That toxic stress is the strong, unrelieved activation of the body's stress management system in the absence of protective support. And I think if we take and accept that definition as being true, then you cannot argue that corporal punishment is harmful and interferes with that healthy development. We've already talked about, again, this morning I think was a wonderful, delicious appetizer for your lunch, and we already talked about the differences between punishment and discipline. I love the word discipline. The word disciple comes from discipline, and as parents, aren't we kind of shepherding our children through learning about becoming who they are? So I use the term "a line in the sand" as kind of a form of irony, because I came across this legal paper published in a journal by some law professors at Duke that tried to distinguish where that line was between corporal punishment and physical abuse. And the article was very thoughtfully written. It was about 50 pages. And it was really hard for me to read because it's legal jargon. I'm used to medical jargon. And as I'm going through it, I got to page 35, and I looked up and I'm like, what in the heck are they talking about? It doesn't matter. It's not rational. In what other setting do we say, well, it depends how hard they're hit? And if it's not that hard, then it's okay. Or it depends what the child did to provoke the parent hitting them. I mean, it just is ridiculous. So I would say it's on a continuum. And as we get closer to the dark end of the arrow, we start becoming dangerously close to abusing children. So risk factors for abuse. It's important to consider that there's, I think, 3 separate domains. There's characteristics of the child that make them more likely to be abused, and we know that young children, less than the age of 4, are more at risk, as are children with special needs. And I use quotes because that can mean any kind of needs. It can mean developmental delays. It can mean maybe a child who's adopted, who has attachment, who has insecure attachment, and makes them a little more challenging to raise. It could be particular temperament of the child, and I'm not going to say a bad temperament, but I'm going to say a temperament that a parent isn't equipped to deal with, okay? Because we have to accept the fact as parents, we often come into parenting with expectations of what that child's going to be like, and guess what? They often don't match up to what we actually have before us. For parents, we know that having a lack of child development is going to put them at risk for having unrealistic expectations of their child, and may resort to using physical abuse. Social isolation, which I think is such a profound factor. We talked about poverty, but I think inherent with the poverty is social isolation. When we have young mothers trying to raise their babies, and they're living in an apartment, which maybe they're glad to be out of their family of origin, but they're alone. They don't know anybody else in the apartment complex to go to for help. How can we expect that mother to succeed without loving community members there to help her? Parental characteristics. We know that younger age, less education, more kids, and a lower SES makes that family more at risk. And of course, the role that substance abuse and mental health issues. And the one issue that I see, and I think I was somewhat surprised in my work at the Chicago Children's Advocacy Center when I'm seeing sexual abuse victims, more times than not, when there's sexual abuse, there's a domestic violence history in the family. And that relationship is just really profound and humbling to me. And we also have to look at families in their community. Again, violent neighborhoods, it makes it harder to have social connections, right? If you don't feel safe to go outside. One of the things I've been really struggling with is what to do with my families where there's obesity in their children. And you talk about activities. Well, for many families, they can't go outside, they can't go to the park, so it severely limits how their children are able to work off those calories. And so these community problems have profound effects on children's health overall. So, DCFS will refer to excessive corporal punishment, which is also physical abuse, as allegation number 11. They're all assigned numbers, cuts, welts, and bruises. And these are the factors, this is right off of the DCFS website, of what they consider when making a determination of whether something rises to the level of indicating a parent, saying there's credible evidence that this abuse has occurred. And these are the things. So obviously younger age, the location of the injury, if a child is hit on their head, that's going to be taken as more serious than if the child is spanked on their bottom. If there's a pattern of injury. The bottom line is that in general, a case will become indicated if marks are left behind. Okay? So I'm going to show you two cases that I've selected from the many ones that I've evaluated. The first is an 18-month-old female, and as one of our home visitors was so profoundly said that when children start cruising around, that's when the trouble often starts, because they're curious, they want to learn about their environment. And to this young mom, 20 years old, her partner was 22, and they had an almost 3-year-old in addition to this 18-month-old. And mom told us at the time the child came in for an evaluation of burns on her hands, that she was pregnant with her third child. So look at that picture. We have a 20-year-old living in an apartment with her abusive partner and another active preschool-age toddler. And this is what we saw and one of the other things that I make sure that our student and our residents rotating through our rotation learn about is an exam must include looking at every inch of their skin, of a child's skin, because many of these injuries are covered up. And I don't know if you can see very well, but what this little 18-month-old had on her abdomen was a linear pattern scar from being hit with an extension cord. And she's got a loop mark on her back. And I don't know if you can see those excoriations on her back. Does anybody know what those are from? Fingernails, adult fingernails being dug into her back. And as is often our practice, when there's other young children in the home, we like to examine them as well. So we asked mom to bring in her older brother, and he also had loop marks on his back. So if we go back to the risk factors I described, this isn't a surprise that this mother came in with these children. She's young, she hadn't completed high school, she's in a violent relationship, she doesn't have any family support, she moved out of her mother's house because of her own history of abuse as a child. She was a sexual abuse victim whose mother didn't believe her. So again, this is unfortunately a somewhat predictable outcome. The other case I saw just last month was this delightful 13-year-old who was brought in for evaluation of both sexual and physical abuse. And the story that she told me was that she decided to take her mother's iPad out of her mother's purse to play Flappy Birds, and I don't know, has anybody played that game? The young people. Of course, because my intern was like, oh, I know what that is, and it's a highly addictive game. I can see why she did that. But this caretaker who I spoke with said to me, yes, I whooped her with a belt. She was told not to take my iPad out. And then I said, then what happened? She said, well, I got tired. So I went upstairs and I told my husband to continue whooping her. So fortunately, this young girl told a friend at school who told the teacher, and that's how she came to see us. These are the marks, and what I would just point out, again, they're not very easy to see, but she has a mark on her left shoulder and in the back of her leg. You can see the pattern of the belt that was used, but she also had injuries that were very old that had healed. So this is a kid who lived in an environment where she was chronically being abused. And I think what struck me most with both of these cases and what I commonly see with physical abuse, it's not just the sadness I feel about the abuse, it's the absence of that secure attachment, okay? It's the sadness in the face of this 13-year-old girl that just wants somebody to love her. She was adopted by this mother, and the mother, you could tell, just didn't have that warm, positive feeling about her daughter that all children deserve to have. What was very interesting to me, and I didn't see this until I was pulling up that DCFS information, but this is also on the DCFS website. And it's a document that any parent, any foster parent has to sign, any person who applies for a DCFS daycare license has to sign, saying that you promise not to use corporal punishment. That's crazy. So then, the only people that can use corporal punishment are if you're the natural parent or the biological parent. But so we're saying it's not right for foster parents or daycare providers to use, but parents can. Okay. So how many of you have heard this? We can talk about it right this moment. And I'm not going to talk about why I think this is outrageous, but I'll just show you some images that suggest why I think it's outrageous.
Oh yeah, right. Oh, that poor.
I think a picture is worth 1,000 words, and that those pictures alone can explain why spanking is not okay. Okay, what's this though? Right. You know, I Googled this map and I looked at it and I said, you know, this pattern looks familiar. I've seen it before. Did anyone else ever that? So I thought it'd be interesting to overlay it on other maps. So this is a map of child abuse fatalities for 2007, and the darker states are the areas with more child abuse fatalities. So if I overlay the other map, and this is something I never heard of before. Is anyone familiar with the United States Peace Index? I never heard of it, but it takes into account homicide rate, violent crime, incarceration, police presence, and availability of firearms. And again, darker states mean less peace. Firearm homicide rates. And finally, state executions. That's pretty dramatic, I think. So I don't know, has anybody heard of this book, To Train Up a Child? Okay, all right, I'm going to show this. Do I have time to show this brief clip?
Punishment Tonight, Part 2 of a 360 investigation of a parenting book that's controversial to say the least. A book that says God wants parents to spank their children and that the spanking should be hard enough to cause physical pain. The book was found in the home of parents in California who were convicted of beating their 7-year-old daughter to death. The couple who wrote the book say they're in no way to blame. Gary Tuckman investigates.
Michael Pearl is a competitive knife and tomahawk thrower. He
Your own
never
joke.
misses the target. But it's just a hobby. His life's work is preaching. He targets what some might call extreme discipline of children.
I've never met any well-trained, emotionally secure, happy, creative children that weren't spanked.
Pearl is a minister of the gospel, a devout Christian. He and his wife are best-selling authors who have written many religiously themed books.
This is the Russian good and evil.
But their most popular and most controversial is a book called To Train Up a Child, in which they write about the need to inflict physical pain.
No, I don't use the term hitting.
Wait, what's the word?
Spanking.
And is there a difference?
Absolutely. A hand is hitting. A little switch is spanking. A wooden spoon or spatula, rubber spatula, that's spanking.
In the book, the Pearls who live in rural Tennessee declare the rod is a gift from God. Use it as the hand of God to train your children. They say any spanking to effectively reinforce instruction must cause pain. This couple believed in the Pearls. Kevin and Elizabeth Schatz, parents of 9 children, read their book. As a matter of fact, the book was found in their house and put in an evidence bag after the California couple pummeled one of their daughters for hours. 7-year-old Lydia Schatz, who had been adopted from Liberia, died after suffering horrific injuries all over her body.
Okay, I'm gonna end it there. I'm not sure what to say after that, but I think we need to look for other sources for other helpful parenting advice. And who better than Blossom?
That's Amy now.
I don't know if you know this, but actually Blossom has a PhD in the neurosciences from UCLA. So she knows about brain science, okay? And I would say I really, I've read not all of her book, but some of it, and I think the part that she wrote about discipline is very good. She included this quote. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this, but Astrid Lindgren wrote Pippi Longstocking. she is a woman without any letters after her name, but I think has written a beautiful book about not just discipline, but the joys of parenting. And I think we forget that. And we're, especially pediatricians, we're always providing anticipatory guidance of what to caution parents not to let their children do. And we don't take enough time to say, what are your child's strengths? What do you enjoy about your child? This is one of her quotes that I think is the fundamental question. What is the goal of parenting? Is it to control a human being, or is it to grow a healthy human? Well, I'm hoping we can spread the message that we need to grow more healthy humans. This is another one of her phrases that I love, because this is something I hear in the clinic all the time. And I should mention, we have a clinic at Stroger where we see follow-up patients, and actually several of our patients have been recruited from the waiting room. When parents have used corporal punishment in the waiting room, they get referred to our clinic. But one of the things I'll hear sometimes young mothers and grandmothers of babies is, I keep telling her not to hold that baby when she cries because she's going to spoil her. And I've said, well, food spoils, and why does food spoil? Because we forget about it, we neglect it. So we're not going to spoil babies or children by giving them the attention that they need. The World Health Organization issued this paper on violence prevention, and what it talked about, which I think is fundamental to making this movement successful, which is to try to change our social norms, and that allowing people to use physical violence to rear their child really just reinforces the norm that violence is okay in some situations. And it makes it hard for people who are raised in those situations to discriminate, because then they become, we know the facts that people raised in homes where there's corporal punishment are more likely to use physical violence in their other relationships. And I think there's a synergistic relationship between norms and laws. And if you look at smoking, seatbelts, infant car seats, drunk driving, look at where marriage equality has come in a decade.
Yeah.
And somebody made reference to smoking on planes and how that was acceptable. And these things look comical now. I mean, I love the picture of the nurses huddled around the light. But I have a friend who's a retired nurse who says, yeah, we used to hang out in the doctor's lounge and yuck it up over cigarettes, and I think it's just crazy, but what we know. But we know public education works, it helps, it changes minds. The car seat, do you know that car seats started, the movement started in Tennessee by a pediatrician who noticed that kids that came into the emergency department were more likely to have serious injuries if they were not restrained. And so he thought that a car seat was an important thing to implement. And it took him about a decade to get it passed in Tennessee. But then once it passed in Tennessee, it went viral and it passed everywhere. And now I don't think any of us would think about putting a young child in the car without one. So we clearly need to change the norms around parenting. And I'm going to start with the first PSA. We're going to have a late-breaking one from Dane County soon, but I want to talk a little bit about this. Dr. Drew.
Can spanking cause mental illness? Well, researchers in Canada say physical punishment is linked to mood disorders, substance, and personality disorders. Now, I got to tell you, this is not a mystery to those of us that work with people who have been affected by these sorts of behaviors from their parents. There's a 100% probability if somebody gets to me that they had childhood trauma of some type. And there's just no doubt that physical punishment affects how our brains develop. It's not open for debate for people that work with children and work with trauma survivors. Just
thank you, Dr. Drew. But wouldn't that be great? How many people have seen that? Or does your neighbor know that? We need to get the message out. I don't know if any of you read The Onion. The Onion got me through the Bush years. I think we need to tell parents that they need a toolbox of different techniques to use with their children. And sometimes mommy needs a timeout. Yes. So the other messages I'd love to promote is this idea of serve and return. Do you know how in the early 90s it was back to sleep, right? You said back to sleep and everybody started putting babies on their backs or their sides and we reduced the rate of SIDS. How about serve and return? That's 3 words. And what does it mean? It means looking at your child and, you know, really being in the moment and being like what we call a mindful parent now. I think that's the common language. But that serve and return, how can you possibly become violent with a child you're serving and returning with? I want 2 solutions really quick and then I'll be finished. So parent cafes, I don't know if any of you are familiar with them. I think they're a wonderful model for our community. The idea is to have a group of parents get together. There's a host who's trained in the protective factors, and these are the 5 things we want to help parents build with each other. Parental resilience, social connections, the knowledge about child development, because we know that's going to be a protective factor against abuse. Concrete support, okay? Helping people ask for help when they need it. And teaching our children social and emotional competence. And I have a little example from my personal life about my own mini cafe. This lovely young lady is my daughter, Mariana, who's 10 today. Okay, so I got a call a couple weeks ago from her best friend's mother. She said, you know, I was supposed to stay out all weekend. Apparently Mariana was mad at her and she doesn't know why. And I'm like, oh dear. So a week later, 2 weeks later, I get a call from Johnny's mom, and Mariana was icing him. So I'm like, what am I gonna do? So we got together. I got with each of these parents and their child separately. So the 4 of us sat around the table and talked about what happened and modeled for our children how to express their feelings and how they should talk to each other. And it was amazing because since then, there have been no problems. But again, I think this idea that I hear my parents say, well, work it out yourselves with your siblings. How do we know how to do that unless somebody either models it or helps us? Okay. And then I'll end with talking about the value, I think, of visiting nurse programs and home visitor programs, meeting people where they're at. It's good to know the ACA has some money built in to fund these programs. DHHS has worked very hard to find the programs that have shown the best success and that they do important work, helping outcomes, reducing child abuse, helping connect people with their community resources, which I think is so valuable, is making people feel less isolated. You know, when I think of that young mom with the 2 children who were physically abused, I think, instead of taking her children away, what if we took her and put her in the house of an Italian grandmother? You know, somebody just like oozing love and nurturance, and wouldn't that be better and cheaper? But DCFS laughed at me when I suggested it. I really want to do that with our failure to thrive babies. I think that's what they need. It's not taking the baby away that we need to do. We need to take mommy and baby and put them in a home where somebody can teach them what to do. Nurse-family partnership is one of those examples that's been around for a long time. I love reading about their work and look forward to seeing what's going to happen in Chicago with it. And I'll end with this quote, but we're going to hear the latest PSA from the folks from Dane County.